right.
Cool. Oh, I love that picture.
Should get going. All right. I call this meeting of the Sons of the American Revolution San Diego chapter to order. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please stand while I present the invocation? Almighty God, we ask you for your blessing on this chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution. It is our purpose is to promote sound learning and true patriotism and to further all that is good in our community. So we will pray that you will strengthen our hands in all that we do, that we may serve our nation to your honor and glory. Amen. Color guard, would you present the colors, please?
Color guard, attend, touch, present. Colors.
How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling fine. My hair's still clogged.
Yeah.
Mark line, march.
It's weird because it's pretty much the outer ear canal. It feels like there's still something in the outer ear, but it's not painful.
Present. Color.
Have you tried using a Q-tip?
Sorry, you're breaking up.
Have you tried using a Q-tip?
I don't want to stuff anything in there.
Yeah.
Attend, touch.
I mean, just to help clean it out.
It's not. No, this is like. It's almost like it's either thickened or swollen or something. It's not wax or mud. It's the skin itself.
Gentlemen,
It's like the ear canal is closed off a little bit. It may be just a reaction to having had the infection. I don't know.
I think you should go to the doctor again, or a doctor.
How?
Live streaming the conversation
Well,
about ears during the posting of the colors, guys.
You know, when I had my ear closed, this was
gentlemen,
about 10
I'm going to
years
mute
ago,
everybody.
maybe more. I just
Okay, we're going to do things a little differently today. We sing God Bless America, but we're fortunate to have Paula Jo Cahoon with us, who's going to sing the national anthem. Paula Jo?
Yes, good morning and thank you, Barry. Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you. Thank you, Paula Jo. I really do appreciate that.
Thank you for inviting me.
I don't see compatriot Leslie here, so I will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag
of the United States of America,
to the republic
for which it stands,
one nation,
under
God,
God, indivisible,
with
with
liberty.
liberty and justice for all.
for all.
Compatriot Herman, would you lead us in the pledge to the SAR?
We, the descendants
of
the heroes of the American Revolution,
by
who by their sacrifices
established
established the United States of America, reaffirm our faith in the principles of liberty and our constitutional republic, and solemnly pledge ourselves to defend them against every foe.
Thank you. Color Guard Commander, would you please retire the colors?
Ready, two, right, face, forward, march. Color guard, halt, to your post.
Okay, would everyone please be seated? I would like to formally introduce Mrs. Paula Jo Cahoon, who is the Linares DAR chapter regent. For those of you who don't know Paula Jo, her husband was a member of our chapter. And Paula Jo, would you like to say a few words?
Oh, just good morning, Barry, and thank you so much for inviting me. I always love to sing the national anthem. It's my favorite song. And good luck on your next meeting as well. And just good morning, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Unfortunately, our next two guests aren't with us today, so we'll skip right over and also introduce.
Barry?
Yes, sir.
Barry, this is Jim Klingler. I am with
Oh,
you
Jim, I'm
today.
sorry.
My apologies. I signed in a little late,
Okay.
but thank you for inviting me. And once again, congratulations to the San Diego chapter on the great Memorial Day event that you planned and the nationwide coverage. So that was wonderful. And then I'll just remind everybody that our National Congress is coming up next month in July in Renton, Washington. The hotel is on a lake, Lake Washington. So there's still time to register and go on the national website. You can sign in if you want to. So thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you, Jim, and my apologies for not checking my participant list.
Yeah, that's okay.
Okay. Today our speaker is noted author Charlie Frye from the Redlands chapter. Welcome back, Charlie.
Thank you.
For those of you who attended our February and April meetings, you'll recall Charlie discussing how the British reconnoitered around the Boston area and talked a little about a little known patriot, Paul Dudley Sargent, and his participation, at the Siege of Boston. Today, Charlie's going to talk about the Battle of Bunker Hill and has a pretty neat surprise in store for us. Welcome, Charlie.
Thank you.
Before we get to Charlie's talk, we'll do that in a little bit. I've got a few other housekeeping items to go through. First, I'd like to introduce two new members. They're junior members. They're Sean Andrew McDermott and William Francis McDermott. These young men are both grandsons of our Sergeant at Arms, Gary Newton. So compatriot Newton, please welcome them for us, and we look forward to seeing them at a meeting soon.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
And can you tell me who their patriot ancestor was?
Pardon me, Barry?
Their patriot ancestor.
The patriot ancestor is a William Robbins. He was in the Continental Army, fought at Monmouth, was at Valley Forge, and several other places.
Okay. Great.
Yeah, he was with the New Jersey Blue Line.
Oh, okay. Very good. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Gary. Now it's time for a little bit of June history. June was an especially busy month for our patriots throughout the duration for our quest for independence. On the 1st in 1776, Congress agreed to raise a militia of 6,000 to reinforce the army in Canada and to keep up communication with that province. Now, 2 days later, however, they agreed to add another 13,800 militia to defend New York, and then an additional 10,000 man mobile force. So they did a lot of recruiting during that time. On the 3rd, President Adams in 1800 became the first acting president to take up residence in Washington, D.C. The president's house, now known as the White House, was not yet ready for him. So he moved into Tuncliffe City Tavern for a period of time. And then he moved into the White House in November. But even though he was in the White House, it was still nowhere near completion, and did a lot of construction going on. On the 4th in 1754, then Lieutenant Colonel George Washington, out of necessity, builds Fort Necessity, a makeshift fort to protect his troops from French soldiers enraged by the murder of an ensign, Joseph de Monville, who was in Washington's custody at the time. On the 7th, in 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution for independence of the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, leading to Thomas Jefferson's writing the Declaration of Independence a month later. On the 14th, in 1775, George Washington accepted the assignment to lead the Continental Army, thereby establishing it as an army. And as many of you know, we recently celebrated the Army's birthday last Monday. 1 year later, Delaware would also declare their independence. Now, Delaware at the time was not a colony, but it was considered one of the 2 colonial assemblies of Pennsylvania. So they broke away earlier than everyone else. And also on the 14th, in 1777, the Continental Congress approved the Stars and Stripes as the official flag of the United States. So the 14th is a big day in our history. Also, it's the birthday of my company 11 years ago. So the 14th is very special for a lot of reasons for me. On the 17th in 1775, the British General William Howe landed his troops on the Charlestown Peninsula overlooking Boston. The ensuing battle led to Patriot General William Prescott to reportedly tell his men, "Don't one of you fire until you see the whites of their eyes." So that's where that term comes from, supposedly. It looks like Charlie's talk is very timely since that happened just 2 days ago in history. On the 18th, the British position in Philadelphia became untenable in the War of 1812. So not the War of 1812. So they had, after France entered the war on the side of the Americans, they had to abandon Philadelphia. To the French fleet, General Clinton was forced to lead his British Hessian force to New York City and land there. The Continental Congress returned a week later, and then 34 years later, the British left Philly again, or came back to Philly during the War of 1812. On the 21st, Spain declared war on Great Britain, creating a de facto alliance with the Americans. Spain's King Charles III would not consent to a treaty of alliance with the United States because one imperial power encouraging another imperial power's colonies to revolt was a really treacherous game. In 1788, New Hampshire became the ninth and last necessary state to ratify the Constitution of the United States of America. And on the 30th, in 1775, Congress drafted the Articles of War, but purposely tried not to lay blame with King George III, but instead blamed the ministers in Parliament, stating attempts of the British ministry to carry out into execution by force of arms several unconstitutional oppressive acts were due to the British Parliament. So that's our history for the month. Also, I'd like to honor a couple of our members. The first is compatriot Ray Razor, who received the national recognition for his work with the Operation Ancestor Search Project. This program helps active duty service members find Patriot ancestors so they too could be eligible for the SAR. So congratulations, Ray. I would also like to congratulate our Color Guard Commander Duncan Campbell, as he earned recognition as the California Society's Color Guardsman of the Year. Duncan's diligent work attending multiple events across the country put him on the top. He contributed also to making the San Diego Color Guard a very close second for the Color Guard Unit of the Year to perennial winners Orange County. We've been told that we have a good shot at beating them next for this year. So let's give both gentlemen a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, now, as Jim said, this past month on Memorial Day, the chapter hosted a national tribute to our fallen veterans that was joined by chapters from across the country. Some chapters brought greetings while others laid wreaths at selected monuments in their area. Each of those was recorded on video. Oh, sorry. A combined Color Guard unit from chapters throughout California laid wreaths at the Pearl Harbor Memorial at Tuna Wharf, the nearby Aircraft Carrier Memorial, the USS San Diego Memorial, and the Leyte Gulf Memorial. They also laid wreaths aboard the USS Midway. Compatriot Master Chief Philip Hinshaw laid wreaths for the 52 Boats Memorial in Liberty Station and the USS Roncador Memorial at Naval Base Point Loma. An especially poignant wreath laying was at the Vietnam Memorial at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. In this picture, you can see from left to right, San Diego chapter members and lieutenant commanders, Larry Harden and James Helt. We have Jim Olds from the Harbor chapter, Bill Ney from the Redwood chapter, and Jim Klingler, our illustrious CASAR Vice President South, lay wreaths. Each of these men served in Vietnam, as did several other Color Guardsmen in attendance. And I would like to thank everyone involved in making this national event a success. And I especially want to thank Duncan, not only for bringing the idea forward, but handling the lion's share of all the coordination. Thank you, Duncan. If you missed the event, you can go to our YouTube channel and site to watch, and I believe you'll enjoy it. At the last count, over 350 people have watched various parts of the event. So we got a lot of play even after Memorial Day. So that was nice. And with that, it's time to introduce our guest today, Charlie Frye. Compatriot Charles E. Frye is a geographer, cartographer, information scientist, and a U.S. Army veteran. His interests include genealogy, the history of the American Revolutionary War, and Major League Baseball. I thought I liked you for a reason. As he learned of Isaac Frye's story, he applied his skills to design an approach to use geographic information systems to organize and document historical research projects. Applying this approach to Isaac Frye's story yielded a wealth of information that could be organized in many ways. This applied the skeleton for the War Has Begun, the first of 4 books in the Duty and the Call of Liberty series. Compatriot Frye is a member of the Redlands chapter. And Charlie, thank you so much for agreeing to do this on such short notice. I really do appreciate it. So now I will turn it over to you. And if you'll give me just one moment, I will give you this share. Okay. All right. Post. Okay, let me stop sharing. All right.
So thank you, Barry.
All right.
So
This presentation that I'm going to give today is actually the first presentation I'd ever created, and I actually gave it about 15 years ago to the Redlands chapter, and it's evolved quite a lot since then. But the map that you see here is my first kind of attempt at using geographic information systems to apply it to military history, and in particular, it was the Battle of I called it Bunker Hill at the time, and I'd say 7 out of 10 people who hear me say that want to correct me and say Breeds Hill, and so I'm going with the flow, although I think there's a good case for both of them. This map is something I put together in conjunction with the Library of Congress's map scanning program. So they have many of the maps that illustrate the battle in their collection. And in the late 1990s and early 2000s, they began scanning them at what they call research quality resolution. And I show a few of them here on the poster. Let's see what we'll advance. Here we go. So most of my background is Barry already covered. But one of the things that I was realizing as I was getting interested in history was that histories can be difficult to get into if you don't have a purpose. And the easiest purpose I've always found was being interested in the history of a specific person. And at that point, the history begins to become human in the sense of things that we can all relate to. So I wanted to start off with a couple of images of the landscape of what the Battle of Bunker Hill or Breeds Hill ultimately was set upon. And it's a little difficult to see in this, but this is it's the Charlestown Peninsula, and it's just opposite Boston. Today there's a bridge going across it, and if you walk across the bridge, you're on the Freedom Trail as it's been named since. And the redoubt, which is right here, is very close to where the current Bunker Hill Monument is located. So if you've been to the monument, you are in that vicinity. This next view is one that was actually from the history of Charlestown. And this gives a kind of a profile view of the Charlestown Peninsula. So you can see that there were 3 hills on the peninsula. Moulton Hill, which is just off of Moulton Point, was the smallest of them. Breeds Hill was kind of the middle-sized hill, and then Bunker Hill is by far the largest of them. And so there was some interesting, ideas about what the tactics or the strategy would be if either side were to have invested and taken possession of the Charlestown Peninsula during the Siege of Boston. And the Americans happened to act first. So 246 years ago, things got going in the sense that there's a reason we had the Battle of Breeds Hill, which was that thousands of men were spoiling for a battle. And the note I have here is that the idea of righteous anger and hatred, that's actually taken from the National Park Service's description. So it's unusual for our national government to use the word hatred in a descriptive way. And as I've read back through the various histories, and particularly the Battle of Lexington and Concord made for a lot of personal enemies on both sides. And the majority of militiamen and citizens, didn't see the Battle of Lexington and Concord as anything but an escalation, and since it didn't resolve anything. And the result, though, is the Siege of Boston, where there were at the largest moment about 20,000 militiamen from the 3 New England states surrounding Boston and keeping the land side of traffic shut down. And by the 16th of June, the Americans had become fairly well organized in the sense that, in various history of the dates, we actually had an army, although news of that had not reached Boston yet, in the sense that it took usually about 5 days for news from Philadelphia to reach Boston, for 2 days to New York and 3 more days on a fast horse to Boston from New York. So the Massachusetts government was effectively in charge at this point and was organizing things. One book I found that was particularly useful to kind of set this context, because it goes back quite a bit further and talks about the arms race in terms of who has cannon and where are they, and who has gunpowder and ammunition, in the sense that there were, even going back into the late 1760s, I think a good number of escalations that were relatively small and that they didn't start a war, but there were times when thousands of militiamen responded to things that there were events in Boston, and the alarm for Lexington and Concord wasn't their first drill. So they were used to making a response, and so this book gets into some of the history behind that and the history behind the guns themselves. And I think, and then it was, for me, it was one of these that this came out a few years ago, and it explained a lot of what I didn't understand early on about this battle. So this is from my original GIS work, and this kind of puts the Charlestown Peninsula in context. So it's about due north of Boston, and Boston has its own peninsula, and then you can see here, this is just on the very far lower left here is the Charles River, and this larger body of water is the Back Bay, which is today all filled in. So the Back Bay is just, it's almost like a neighborhood name rather than a water body. And then to the north is the Mystic River. And so for the 8 years prior to the battle, the British Army had occupied Boston, and they'd actually shut down the port. There's on one of the islands here, there's a few fortifications, and there wasn't even enough room for the entirety of the occupying troops to fit on the Boston Peninsula. So they were going back and forth between the Boston Peninsula and the island here to gain troops. So as the siege of Boston got going, one of the first events was the idea that there were some, 10 to 15,000 people who did not want to be there. They were the citizens of Charlestown and Boston who didn't fancy their streets becoming a battlefield. And early on, General Gage, who was in command of the British forces, negotiated with General Artemus Ward, who was in command of the Massachusetts and American forces, to give everybody who didn't want to be there one day to leave. And so people were ferrying across from Boston to Charlestown and taking one road out, and then they were also leaving Boston directly through Roxbury. And so there was essentially a one-day, wasn't really a ceasefire so much as they just let the populace who didn't want to be there go. So at that point, everybody who was still in Boston was either a loyalist or a spy, and the estimates I've heard about the Charlestown Peninsula range from kind of summary saying, well, nobody was left there, but in truth, there were probably 30 or 40 people left out of a population of potentially as high as 2,000 to 2,500 who had originally been on the peninsula living in the town of Charleston. But a number of them also had homes that were inland, or one in particular I've looked at, it was a Cheever who had a wharf here on the edge. He also had warehouses in Watertown, which was just a couple miles down or upriver on the Charles River. So they all, many of them had places to go because they had family who had moved inland and so on. But the Charlestown Peninsula, by the time of the battle, was effectively a no man's land in the sense that people weren't normally there. And then, kind of filling in some of the descriptions. So as I noted before, Bunker Hill was about 110 feet high in those days. All of these hills have been taken down a few notches as their tops have been used to fill in parts of the Back Bay and other areas. One of the difficult things here, you can see I've got a lot of detail here in the very northern tip of Boston, where buildings and streets were. And this is the most detailed that it's appeared on any map that I've been able to find of Charlestown. So there's not actually a detailed map of Charlestown. And one of the reasons for that is Charlestown was burned on the day of the battle, literally in the middle of the battle. And I'll get to when that happened specifically. And so the Americans were looking at this peninsula strategically. If they could take possession of this, a couple of things that could happen. One of which was they would ultimately be able to put cannon on Breed's Hill and that would be within range of firing into Boston. Bunker Hill was not quite in range, although during the battle they found out it might actually have been in range, in the sense that there were certainly both musket balls and cannon that were reaching the top of Bunker Hill, and so they kept to the far side here as they were moving a lot of the troops and so on. Although in some cases they did have to take the road, and that was included risks on its own as well. But General Ward's order, and whether this was a wink-wink order or whether there was true insubordination that followed, was that he wanted Bunker Hill, the top of it back here, fortified. And I think there was a general intention that that was a staging point rather than just the only aim. But as the night of June 16th progressed, and he had assigned about 1,500 men under Colonel Prescott and Richard Gridley and Israel Putnam to go fortify Bunker Hill, they got out there as soon as darkness fell, had a little conference, and went on over to Breeds Hill and started digging. Whether it was Gridley or Putnam is not known, but Gridley, made the first moves in the sense that he staked out the territory. And Gridley, for his background, he's the commander of the artillery, so he's essentially second in command in Massachusetts. And then he is also a surveyor and engineer, so he's the person who's most qualified to determine the nature of fortifications and mark them out. So, even though he decided to take a different hill than he was ordered to take, he's at work doing it. And I've got 1,000 men listed here, but this gets to some of the confusion about this battle, in the sense that there weren't really detailed roles about the states of health, in the sense that were all the men fit for duty. If you take the idea that there were 3 regiments that were generally assigned, that's about 1,500 men. And then some of them weren't digging that night. Some of them were guarding in Charlestown. Some of them were guarding other areas. So on the peninsula, my estimate is that there were about 1,500 men. And that's because there were actually more than the 3 regiments there. James Frye's 10th Regiment, he's a cousin to my patriot ancestor. His regiment had more than 600 men in it. Prescott's regiment had more than 700 in it. Plus there were 200 from Connecticut as well. So that's where I get the idea of 1,500. And at that point, most of them were fit for duty. They hadn't been involved in other major actions. So other than sickness, and nobody wanted to be sick on the eve of battle. That didn't look good, so to speak. So if they were able to carry a shovel or a musket, they were probably present. So with the sunrise on June 17th, the British, of course, noticed the fortifications and immediately began to fire into Breeds Hill from the ships and from the batteries on the Boston Peninsula. The range of a cannon is roughly 1,750 meters, so it's well within range. But generally, the entrenching and the fortifications were effective. In fact, only 1 man was killed all morning long during that bombardment. And in the Army, we learned pretty quickly you stay behind your cover so that you don't get hit by artillery and bullets. So it was described that this man was standing on top of the fortifications, and so at one level it might not have been his best move. By late morning, the British began to stage troops. The Americans, seeing this, and what's going on essentially is Gage and Ward, who's actually clear over 3 miles away in Cambridge, Massachusetts, are trying to figure out how much each is going to commit to any kind of action relative to this entrenchment of Breeds Hill. And they are essentially, going to lay a bet. And so as soon as word gets back to Ward as to how many ships and a guess to how many men are going to show up, he begins figuring out how many of his men he can commit. And he's got a secondary problem. He can't commit all of his men to the Charlestown Peninsula. as there were, he could also be at risk if the British decide to change course quickly and march a large force out of the Roxbury area, which is just on the south side of the Boston Neck, because at that point they could come around and take his headquarters. Another opportunity was to sail men through the Back Bay and land essentially behind the American lines and either cut them off or march again to Cambridge. So that was a problem that Ward had to deal with, in the sense that he couldn't commit all his forces. So the British begin landing, and it says here in this map, the landing of the British. They land on Woolton's Point and begin staging all their men in the early afternoon. So the British moved from this point to essentially what became the battle lines, which is what's now well known to be a rail fence that runs across the northern part of the peninsula. And I don't have it drawn here, but the fortifications were essentially in what was called the declivity of Breed's Hill, going towards that rail fence. This area was actually where I think the most fluid part of the battle was fought, in the sense of each side pushing the others back more than 100 yards in either direction. This is where I think a lot of the casualties outside of the redoubt were sustained in the earlier part of the battle, because there really wasn't cover. I mean, this was kind of in the most normal sense, 18th century stand up, one company or regiment of troops, 50 yards from another company or regiment of troops, and being ordered to fire on each other. One of the things that, one of the kind of 2 or 3 things that I wasn't happy about, 10, 12 years later with this map, was that I didn't have a good understanding of where the American artillery were at this time. But the British artillery are located, I think, fairly correctly. The Americans did have 4 cannon in the redoubt, but they failed, oddly enough, given that Richard Gridley was in command of laying it out, to have it ready to seat the cannon properly. And by the time they began to try to fire them, 2 of them immediately rolled off of their platforms, and it became obvious that they didn't have these built correctly. The other 2, one of them was actually hit by a British cannonball and disabled. And so that left them with 1 cannon, and they ended up deciding that the cannon just weren't going to work from that location. And they dragged it somewhere over here above the 2 E's and Breeds, or maybe even a little further behind by the rail fence. And that was a cannon that was still, so the way this worked out was that each company of artillery on the American side was responsible for 2 cannon. So a guy named John Callender, Captain Callender, was in charge of this particular one. And he was actually firing. The other 2 that didn't make it out and were damaged in the redoubt were under the command of Samuel Gridley, who was the son of Richard Gridley. Samuel Gridley essentially threw his hands up and sent his men back, and he left the scene. And that was kind of the beginnings of the failings of the American artillery. And I'll get into the rest of it in a little bit. One of the questions I was trying to figure out as well in my notion of trying to understand the difference between being in the battle versus at the battle. So a lot of men later would describe themselves as either in or at the battle. And what I was figuring out was that if you were in what I was calling zone 1 here, anybody who was this far was in and engaged in the battle at some point. Zone 2 was certainly dangerous in the sense that lead was flying in from directions. The British had ships here in the Back Bay firing cannon. There was also the potential for the cannon here, as well as musket balls to reach well into this area of Zone 2. This was up here at the peninsula was a bottleneck. All the American troops had to come through this bottleneck. And one of the other things I've done here is that I've started breaking the American troops up into the units as they were deployed. My original map focused more on which regiments were present, but it didn't get into whether there were companies deployed in different locations. And one of the things that I kind of belatedly realized, and it's just not talked about in any of the histories of the battle, is the American right. So you can see there's actually a fairly wide swath here. And the British focused coming up here, but these troops, to get to this point, actually marched around on this road. And the Americans had stationed 3 companies One of my ancestors, well, my Patriot ancestors company was here as well, and they fired enfilading fire on the British Marines as they were marching. And I'm assuming they went up here. So in my original map, I had the Americans clear back up here, but I've moved them down here to where they would have more likely been firing to good effect. The musket range was, a little better than halfway into this field behind the street, and would not have bothered the British too much by the time they had reached either this point or on either of these two roads. So my suspicion is the Americans were taking advantage of the fact that they had the cover of the houses and could wreak a little bit of havoc on the British as they were marching towards the redoubt. Ward, in the meantime, back in Cambridge, had ordered a number of other troops, including 2 other companies of artillery, to begin marching from Cambridge. And all of these troops would make it into the Zone 2, and about half of them made it into Zone 1 during the battle. But many of the men here are often credited as being in this battle, even though about half of them stopped short about, just on the downslope of Bunker Hill. They, in some cases, covered the retreat, and so they were involved that way. The other group that's here I hadn't covered at all before are several companies and regiments who were assigned the task of stopping any British landing here in the back bay. It's called Leechmere's Point, and there were several farms here, but the 2 things happened. One, the British did try to land troops here. However, the wind wasn't favorable to a landing, and the tides as well. So what's shown here in this kind of darker green are what are known as mud flats, or tidal flats. And so when the tide is high, the water goes all the way up to where the light green starts. But when it's lower tide, the mud flats stretch out into the back bay. And so the British decided by late afternoon not to abandon that effort. And most of these troops started marching to across the Charlestown neck here. Only a few of them ultimately reached to the top of Bunker Hill before the majority of these troops who were retreating reached them, and then they all left by the end of the battle. So there were strategic failures on both sides during this battle. And this map that was produced by Lieutenant Thomas Hyde Page, who was a British topographic engineer, and so he was assigned to General Gage's command. He produced this map in the summer after the battle. He's actually showing fortifications here on Bunker Hill that were built by the British Army. He still shows the fortifications that the Americans had put out. Plus, there was a new fortification that the British added to it. But the redoubt and the little extension here were built by the Americans on the night of June 16th. And more importantly, though, from the standpoint of strategy, within the Boston Harbor and Back Bay, you see these soundings that were taken. And you'll notice that they stopped prior to getting into the Mystic River. If you think about this, the British had gondolas of cannon firing back here during the battle, even clear up next to the mill pond. If they had taken the same gondolas up the Mystic River, and they eventually decided to do this very late in the day, and they were successful in doing it, they would have had a substantial opportunity to have fired on the troops that did the most damage to the British troops, which were at the rail fence. The British lost most of their men killed and wounded in this vicinity right here below the rail fence. The second failing was the British decided they were going to go with their kind of standard shock and awe approach of full uniforms, full packs on a 80 to 85 degree afternoon in the hot sun and humidity of Boston. And if you've ever been to New England on a hot, humid day, it's pretty oppressive. It's nothing like San Diego. San Diego has the temperature, but not the humidity. And the British troops gave it a good go, to say the least, but they were, I think, wilting by the time things got going into the later afternoon. So the initial deployment in terms of numbers of troops, the Americans outnumbered the British initially just slightly. This 4,100 and 4,000 are kind of conservative estimates based on numbers of men fit for duty, and who was there, who was coming and going. That was another issue. By the time historians, and in particular, there was a Colonel Sweat in the early 1800s, started getting serious about documenting the history of the battle. It turned out that a lot of the kind of minute-to-minute kind of information had been lost, and they were piecing it together from 35-year-old accounts of people who were there, but that's imperfect, and it's also a large area. So what one person sees and another person sees could be quite different, even though they're standing 300 yards apart, just happen to be looking different directions. Ward in particular had, beyond the men who had gone to do the fortification, ordered the 2 New Hampshire regiments that were present. That's about 1,100 men to take the field, and they were the first ones to get onto the field after those orders had come. And then several of the Massachusetts regiments also marched at around the same time. So by the time the battle began, it was this kind of 4,100 figure facing off against about 4,000 who were all in that kind of first zone along that battle line. So the first 2 phases of the battle were fairly similar in the sense that the British advanced and the Americans repulsed them. The rail fence in particular was a disaster for the British. They had concentrated troops there in kind of conventional wisdom, in the sense they'd stacked up a lot of companies, hoping that they could push through with bayonet charges. What they didn't anticipate is that the Americans chose to have their best marksmen at the rail fence firing, and then for each of them, there were 2 others who were loading and getting the muskets ready. So the Americans' rate of fire was somewhere between, for each man, was about 10 to 12 seconds, compared to about 25 to 30 seconds for the British. So that was a lot more lead coming downhill towards the British, and the Americans were savvy about this. They'd had experience in the French and Indian War. They knew about fighting on terrain. The American commanders, not only did they adhere to the business of don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes, so that they were close enough, they told them to fire low into their bellies. They were not trying to pick off people by, like today we think of like a kill shot of shooting somebody in the head. That wasn't at all how they were thinking. They were thinking to do as much damage by wounding or incapacitating men as possible. And that's kind of a big difference, and a little bit of a misnomer about 18th century battles, that wounding a man was actually better than killing him, in the sense that it took 2 others to carry the wounded man off the field. So for each wounded man, you essentially could hope to remove 3 men from your opponent's ranks. And although, as this illustration I think accurately shows, the British weren't about to go carrying their men off the field just yet. They were seeing that they were aggressive and seeing their opportunity to take out the Americans from their position. It's just that by the time they realized that they had been outthought in terms of tactics, the Americans had cost the British a great deal more than they had expected. The Americans also concentrated fire on the British officers, and I'll get to the toll here in a little bit. So the third phase of the battle, things changed tactically, particularly for the British, and in the sense that they made better decisions. The Americans were forced into tactics that they would rather have not had to use. The British had gained 1,000 Marines as reinforcements. They ditched the coats and the packs and all the hot stuff, rolled up their sleeves and prepared to do whatever it took to take the redoubt. And the Americans, for running out of ammunition on the rail fence, if the British had known that, they would have done differently. But for the most part, the Americans were down to less than 1 musket ball for every 3 men. It was even less inside the redoubt. Another issue for the Americans is that, particularly in the redoubt, those men had been awake and going at hard labor and battle for 30 hours. They were wearing down. The British ultimately overrun the position, and I'll get to a little bit of how that happened here. Although let me back up to do this. I want to go back to this particular depiction. And so what was going on to finish the battle is the British moved away from and concentrated their forces where I have the word fléchés here. And they kind of went counterclockwise around. And the redoubt had a back door leading out towards the word hill and Breed's Hill. So that's how the Americans in the redoubt and their fortifications were going to have to retreat. So essentially you could imagine this spinning about, oops, I got to get back to my map here, spinning about 90 degrees. So this flank comes around there. The British also pushed around to the other side of the redoubt. So even though there were some troops who were overrunning it, a large number were coming out and rotating counterclockwise. And literally what happened was they met in parallel. Right here, I've got one initial American position here in blue above Ward's redoubt, and they were parallel to the word Breed's here. And the problem was that if either side fired, they were more likely going to do their own side opposite them more damage. So the Americans essentially had free rein to get out of the redoubt and begin a more organized retreat up and over Bunker Hill. And there's a couple other things on this map. So this X here. So there were a number of American commanders who, as I said, knew their business about battle in the 18th century. John Stark was a colonel and in charge of the 1st New Hampshire Regiment, and he in particular pounded a stake down there in the mud flat. And he commanded his companies to not fire on the British until they passed that stake. And that stake was somewhere around 30 to 50 yards away. So it was very close from the standpoint of, you could imagine standing and waiting and, potentially having the British fire into your ranks first. The same thing as a concept was true up around this area. And this is where Israel Putnam and Joseph Warren and William Prescott were commanding. And as to which one said it first is not well known, in the sense that it gets back to that we have to trust accounts from 30 and 40 years after the fact. But by the middle of the day, they were all saying, "Don't fire until you see the whites of the enemy's eyes." So they were doing that in particular, though, to conserve ammunition. They wanted every shot to count. And to give you an idea of how this works is that I studied the Battle of Saratoga and looked at it from the standpoint of how many men were deployed and how many musket balls did each of them have. And over the course of the day, they ran out. So the idea was that there were more than 80,000 musket balls marched into battle, and there were about 1,500 casualties. So that meant that essentially 1 in 70 musket balls was finding something besides ground. And so they wanted to improve those odds by making sure the enemy was close enough that if they're going to use a musket as a primary weapon and not a bayonet charge, that they get the most value from it. So this is also a good point to kind of talk about how the battle began to wind down. This cannon up here is actually pretty accurately located. It was probably a little closer to this road. There were 2 other artillery companies that were coming in to the battle towards the middle of it. The first one was led by Scarborough Gridley, who was another son. He was a major of Richard Gridley. And the other one was by Captain Samuel Trevett. The story there was that Scarborough got somewhere into this stretch of houses back a little further, but he ran into his brother Samuel, and Samuel said it was a lost cause, and Scarborough effectively agreed with him and ordered his men to turn around. So Scarborough never made it to the field with his troops. However, Samuel Trevett disobeyed Scarborough's orders and took his cannon up to this position here along the road. But as he was bringing it down the road here, one of the British cannon managed to hit the carriage for one of his 2 cannon and disabled it. So he had to leave it there. So Scarborough shows up with 1 cannon, not Scarborough, but Trevett shows up with 1 cannon. And there was also the cannon that John Callender's men had abandoned here. So Trevett's men actually near the end of the battle began to fire both American cannon to good effect, but my sense is they only had about a half hour to do that before the third charge from the British, which was going to overrun that position. The carriage from Callender's cannon had been damaged, so it was left on the field. And Trevitt retreated and pulled only one of the 6 cannon that had been taken onto the field off, and it was the only one that was recovered in the battle. So the Americans actually lost 5 cannon during the battle due to their kind of lack of practice, we'll say. What ended up happening over this, though, is that because Richard Gridley's essentially, like I said, the second in charge, his son Samuel is essentially immune to prosecution. So John Callender, who was the other captain with Samuel Gridley, was made the scapegoat. He was court-martialed, and he wasn't cashiered, but he was demoted and ended up ranking as a sergeant in a artillery company. But his story was that it was one of redemption, in that he continued on in the company. He was at the Battle of Long Island, and even after his commanders, and he was under Henry Knox by then, but his immediate commander and officers had been killed or wounded, and he took command of his artillery company and held the position to the point where the British opposing him spared his life as they overran him. And so he became well known for his bravery. And as people looked into his story and praised George Washington of it, Washington ended up reversing the court-martial decision and restored his rank. So it took a couple of years, but he was able to survive the politics of the artillery at the Battle of Breed's Hill. And then I'll skip ahead here. So as the British overrun the position, Joseph Warren, who is doing, I think what any good commander would have in that day would have thought to be the honorable thing, is he's trying to get all his men out first, and he ends up being overrun. This particular portrayal is showing that happening. There's a lot more trying to go on in there as well. Salem Poor is credited as having been the American who killed, laying down here, Major Pitcairn of the Marines, and so they're trying to include all of that in this portrayal here. But it gives a sense for the density of the fighting and the desperation of it. So normally in a 18th century battle, the kind of position of honor in defeat is to be willing to capitulate once you've lost 15% of your own soldiers. That kind of stems from the idea that commanders knew that their men were the most important resource rather than anything else. And losing 15% of your men killed or wounded does not reflect well on the commander. The British, on the other, in this case, however, lost nearly 25% of their troops, and it's often described as a Pyrrhic victory because of that. Additionally, for most of the regiments and companies, they lost the officers killed and wounded at nearly 70%. So you can see it, you sense that the Americans very explicitly targeted the British officers, hoping to cause the command and control to degenerate, and hopefully the British would flee the ground, but they didn't. As the Americans had to flee for being out of ammunition, and I think being out of ammunition, it couldn't be underscored more in the sense that after the battle, the degree to which they had depleted their ammunition stores was to the extent that if the British knew, they could have overrun the Americans fairly easily if they hadn't had the shock of losing so many men on their minds. But as such, neither side knew what the toll for the other side had been, and so both commanders took far more conservative positions in how they decided to order their ongoing occupation of Boston in the British case, and continuing the siege in the American case. So, as I mentioned before the meeting, I've been looking at the idea of trying to give a better sense of who may have fought in the battle. And like if you noted, I said earlier, somewhere the Americans started with about 4,100 men and probably added as many as 1,200. If you look at the roles for those companies, it totals up to nearly 5,400 that potentially fought. That said, there were some who were sick and they didn't fight, but we don't know which ones because there was no role. And the issue there is that unless the battle occurs on the day that a role is taken, we don't know who is sick for sure. And we also know that some men get well suddenly in order to participate in the battle. So they may not want to go do the more mundane duties and they're sick for those, but they're certainly willing to look for glory if that's in the offing for a given day. The roles are also somewhat difficult in the sense that several things kind of confound accounting for things. So the Connecticut roles are partial in that some companies were completely missing who did participate, and we know the commanders and the officers, but we don't know who was in the company. And in most cases, and this is true for all three of these colonies, is that the men who fought in 1775 may not have fought in 1776. And in fact, from what I could see, somewhere around 30 to 40% of the men who fought in the Battle of Lexington and Concord only stayed in the Boston vicinity for 7 to 10 days, and they left, and they were replaced by other men from their town's militias. So in many cases, it isn't this kind of presumed continuum of, so you started out in the army at Lexington and Concord and you stayed in. The men were coming and going at a very high rate of turnover. There was also along the New Hampshire border towns that had to band together just for their own safety in normal militia operations, and so many New Hampshire men, in particular, were in Prescott's regiment, and entire companies from Dunstable, which is today Nashua, were under the command of Massachusetts officers, and similarly, there were a few Massachusetts men that were in New Hampshire under New Hampshire command. So it took a little disentangling to figure out, exactly who composed this roughly 5,400 Americans. And so, if any of the rest of you are interested, I'm able to actually show where your men were or your ancestors were during the battle, based on having this role. And I can, you just call out the names. I can search through here. I've got a spreadsheet that I make available on my website. I have first I have a summary of every regiment and company, so I know who all the officers were, how many men were likely in their companies, and depending on, like in here, I've got some of these are red where I don't know everybody who was there. In many cases, this is the idea that we know that half the company was in the battle, but we don't know which half. And then there's cases like this where we know the commander, but we don't know who, we don't have a role for that company in 1775. And so the idea here is that if you want to call out your ancestor's name, like I was looking at William Cheney earlier, there's kind of two ways I can do that now that I know for sure how his name was spelled. I can go down and find him here. So knowing that he was in the he was in the Connecticut regiment under Knowlton. So he was near the redoubt, and you'd said he'd actually been killed. And I actually do keep track of who was killed or wounded or captured, and his name appears on the plaques, which is the roll of honor for those who died in the battle. And if I go back here, I have my GIS of the battle here. That's easier to work with. So Knowlton's men start out right around here, but like I said, this area was much more fluid in terms of battle going back and forth over this landscape. And it's a downhill slope. These fléchés kind of point downhill. And I know the Americans charged into this far and the British charged back up this far. And by the end of the battle, Knowlton's men were moving into this area, and this makes sense. And by the end of the battle, many of the British ships were firing grape shot into Bunker Hill. And that also sets up a lot of potential for friendly fire as well. So it's interesting that they were still doing it at that later in the battle like that. So did anybody else have ancestors in the battle?
if you had anybody in the battle, just unmute and ask Charlie.
Charlie, this is Jim Klingler. I think you, I'd heard your presentation once before, and you'd identified my ancestor, Jonathan Cram, in Stark's regiment in New Hampshire.
Yeah. And let me get it. I got it.
ERAM.
Yeah, I just have to select the right. Yeah, so they were Jonathan Cram of Deerfield. And so in Stark's regiment, so he was, which company was he in? That was the other thing I was wanting to remember.
He was in Dearborn's company, I think.
Yeah. So yeah, so he along with my ancestor knew Dearborn quite well. So that Dearborn's company was in this part of Stark's regiment. This was John Moore's company on the end here. But Dearborn was in this group on the rail fence. So they were part of that group who was firing at a 3-for-1 clip. There are a number of men who are well known for, one was a Sergeant William Adrian Hawkins of Wilton, New Hampshire, who fired so often that the barrel of his musket started to glow a little bit, and he had to use rags to hold it as he kept firing. So it gives you an idea that if they were carrying anywhere from 15 to 20 rounds each, the guys who were firing fought, along this line were firing 50 to 60 times over the course of the battle, and or more depending. I'm not sure that, like I said, the numbers are a little hard to work out in the sense of who was doing what. Men who were wounded were being carried back, so it's it's hard to know exactly what the ratio would have been. Yeah, my ancestor was in this company under, it was Captain Josiah Crosby. This was Wheeler and Crosby's company. And so, but the idea there is that, anybody who was in the battle on the American side, or likely, I like to know about, Don Littlefield had a ancestor who fits into this other category of, he marched with the guys he happened to be sitting around with that day. And he was from, I want to say Connecticut, but he ended up marching with a different company, was in the battle. So, luckily his name's Littlefield and he's in the spreadsheet. So if there are no others, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. This has been kind of, learning about this battle has been kind of one of the more interesting and educational things for me in terms of just learning how history is compiled and what's possible today with information systems and data science, and being able to compile something like this roster. And I should bring up too that my website, I've got this blog section, so I have a download if anybody's interested. I got to click on and I make a download available here, and I'm updating it as I get information. So as I find out that people were or were not in the battle, then I keep the download as current as I can. But I figured I'll be doing that for a few years, and I've gotten some good feedback from a number of other historians. Some of them also had men like Littlefield's ancestor who were would not have appeared on the roll correctly, but they've got letters and journal evidence that say that their ancestor fought that day, and how and who they went with, and so on.
Hey, Charlie, this is Barry. I've got a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
The first is, would you mind if we put your website, a link to your website on our San Diego homepage?
That'd be great. I will copy it here and put it in the
I
chat.
wrote it down.
Okay.
I've got it. My other question was, I didn't know anything about any gondolas being, used.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm assuming they're smaller, like barges.
Yes. In fact,
so what kind of cannon would they have on it? Because I wouldn't think they'd have the big stuff that would be on a.
No, they had 2 and 3 pounders. The smaller brass cannons would have been there. Yeah, I'm looking to. I have a detail of that map, and if I go into. I've got to remember where I stuck everything. Yeah, here we go. And I've got a PDF here that I can, there we go. So in the original map that I made, I ended up finding some of the profiles of the ships. So this map in particular, and I'm gonna use this here. So,
Are you still sharing, Charlie?
oh, did I stop sharing? Let me switch here. Get back to Zoom. There we go. Here we go. So the positions and the types of British ships here are here. I actually, in making this map, found kind of standard profiles for the different classes of ships and sized them based on the number of guns that they had. So the Somerset and the Cerberus were the two 50-plus gun ships. They were roving around in and firing through this vicinity all day. The Spitfire Symmetry in particular went back and forth here. The Glasgow and these gondolas generally stayed back here around the mill pond, firing on the Charlestown Neck, trying to discourage the Americans from crossing to come into the battle. And initially that kind of stopped the Americans, but by the time the day wore on, they figured out that the vast majority of what was being fired here was ineffective. Although there was one notable casualty. It was, and I got to think of his name now. It was
Doctor
McClary, Michael McClary. He was a major in Stark's regiment, and as they were coming into this vicinity here around the bottom of the road coming off of the Bunker Hill, he was supervising his troops crossing back over the neck, and he was killed by a cannon shot. Another one of the I mentioned Paul Dudley Sargent. He was coming along through here and was grazed by a cannonball. I mean, it was he called it a scratch, but it wasn't like they weren't in danger in this vicinity. It just was, more than likely, given the waves and pitching on the gondolas, that they were more for show than effect.
Okay. And just one other comment. Early in the presentation, you said something about righteous anger and hatred. My third or fourth great grandfather was a child during the war, and the word has it he hated the British for the rest of his life. So I can see how that could happen.
Yeah, I had the same sort of thing in my family, although it was that Hessian was a swear word up until my grandfather used. And I suspect that had to do more with my ancestors' later encounters with the Hessians in various battles, but he wouldn't have liked them very much.
Understand. Okay. Does anybody else have any questions for Charlie?
Charlie, this is Jim Klingler. I do have a question in your research. I've always been curious as to why, if the assignment was to build at Bunker Hill, they ended up on Breeds Hill. And I've heard various comments. I know you've done a lot more research than most of us have. And in looking at your map today, second time through is always a little bit better. Breeds Hill seems to be more centrally located on Charlestown Peninsula. So I wonder, did that have anything to do with it?
It had everything to do with wanting to start a fight. And the point here is that you can see this battery here in the northern end of Boston. That was within range of Breeds Hill. And if you wanted to escalate versus merely fortify and have a pretty good chance of keeping what you took, you would have stuck to Bunker Hill, because the British couldn't easily oust you. I mean, they could have fired from here, but they're firing up 110 feet. And all they can do is annoy you, essentially. But the Americans could have dug in quite effectively here. But my sense was always that, and what I've read is in the various accounts, there was definitely an intention to start the fight. And Gridley and Putnam in particular were known as fairly pugnacious individuals. Prescott was a little more measured, but I think he was, I think, just as much for building and dealing with this. He was, how to put it, to say the least, he was all in on the battle. And by the end of the battle, he was the one who had stormed off the field, got a horse, rode to Ward, and asked for 2 more regiments to go knock the British off the peninsula. And he was lucky that he didn't get that, because he wouldn't have had any ammunition. But that was the degree to which he was committed to this course. I mean, I don't know if they would have expected to have defeated the British completely, though. And that's, so in other words, they wanted to have a fight, but to what end? And that's the question that nobody has a good answer to.
All right. Any other questions for Charlie? All right. Take back the screen. Can you all see my screen?
Yep.
All right, good. Charlie, thank you. That was really good. I really appreciate that whole talk. It was very enlightening.
You're welcome. I enjoy giving it. It's like I said, it's the first one that I got interested in, and so it's gotten better and better over the years, and I enjoy doing the talk.
Great. So with that, on behalf of the chapter, I'd like to thank you so much. If you'll give me your mailing address, we'd like to send you a certificate of appreciation on behalf of the chapter. So thank you for doing all 3 of these presentations. They're very well accepted, so to speak. So thank you. Nope, wrong way. Okay, I've got a few announcements before we close out today. First is to let everyone know that there is a bylaw change that we voted on at the National Congress. If you're going to be there, please let me know so we can make you a delegate. This bylaw change seems to be very straightforward and simple. They're basically going to change the current wording in bylaw 21, section 1, where it says facilities, to what is now called headquarters and maintenance. So there's no other changes other than the name change for that. So just to make you all aware of it. Another announcement is that I think some of you might know that Amazon is having their Prime Day starting tomorrow. And if you will be shopping with Amazon, you can actually donate to our chapter without spending any extra money. What happens is if you go to Amazon Smile, anything you purchase through that portion of Amazon's site will get a 0.5% of their profit on whatever you buy. So there's no extra cost to you. It uses the same login information as regular Amazon, and all your Prime benefits still apply. And this works for people that don't have Prime as well. So please do that. I will be posting instructions on how to do that on the chapter website later today under the donate tab. And as a friendly reminder, we have the Independence Day parade coming up. We'll be walking down Orange Avenue. We've got some Mustangs to take some of our elder statesmen down the road. So please join us. You can bring the family, bring the kids. They can march with us too. And that same weekend, we are going to be at the Balboa Park International College.
Could you bring my power source on?
I'm sorry?
Please.
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Okay. At the International Cottages, we'll be with our perennial host, the House of Spain. And new this year will be with the House of the USA. So that's new. So this year we really need help with your support this year. Since it's a 2-day affair, going from 10 to 4 each day, we really need some people to help us set up, take down, greet and meet people, and explain what what we're all about. So please contact Philip Hinshaw if you'd like to support the House of Spain, and Duncan Campbell if you want to support the House of the United States. And we really do appreciate your help there. I will be joining them one of those 2 days. I just don't know which one yet. So I'd love to see you guys there. And as a reminder, as Jim Klingler said, we've got the 131st Annual Congress. If you're going, please let me know. We have our fall Board of Managers meeting in the Mission Inn in Riverside. So please plan accordingly. Hope to see you there. And that's really all I've got for announcements. Does anyone have an announcement they'd like to make before we close?
Barry, just briefly on the Wreath Across America campaign 2021.
Yes.
Plan to kick that off after the 4th of July, get all the other celebrations out of the way, so there'll be more forthcoming on that.
Okay.
And then Fred Hall last year provided some contacts with other organizations that were very beneficial. So if anybody has any other organizations they want to pass on info to me, which I might contact about Wreath Across America, would be appreciated.
Yeah. Thank you, Larry. I appreciate you bringing that up. And as Larry said, he was able to get a couple of other organizations to help us sell almost 250 wreaths last year, which really netted the chapter, I think, of $1,250.
Right around there, yes.
Yeah, 1,200. Yeah, that we use, to pay for medals and things of that nature. So if you do know of an organization that would like to participate with us, please let us know. Okay. I want to thank you all for taking the time to be with us. I know on a Saturday morning it might be hard. Next time we meet will be in person. And on Zoom and YouTube as well. So we're going to do this as a multimedia type of event. One good thing that came out of a year and a half of lockdown is that we now know how to successfully hold meetings virtually. So now the next challenge will be to hold them virtually and in person at the same time. Look forward to seeing you all there. So if you'll all please stand for the benediction. May the peace of God, which passes all understanding, keep you in your hearts and minds in the knowledge and love of God, and the blessings of God Almighty be amongst you and remain with you always. Amen. And compatriot Newton, would you lead us in the recessional?
Until we meet again, let us remember our obligation to our forefathers who gave us our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, an independent Supreme Court, and a nation free men.
Thank you. Okay, now color guard, would you please retrieve the colors?
Cut and cut. Forward. March. Mark time. March. Color guard. Halt. Right. Face. Retrieve the colors. Again, cut. Bounce. Face. Mark time. march, forward, march, color guard, halt, to your post.
Oh, that's great.
So this concludes our meeting for today. I want to thank you all for attending, and I look forward to seeing you in person. The location is to be determined. We're working on that. But again, we'll be online with Zoom and on live streamed on YouTube. So if for some reason you can't make it physically, please join us virtually. And with that, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody.
See you all too.
Keep up the good work, guys. It's a great job.